Okay, with that, we're going to get started. And please do keep using the Zoom chat. I'll be explaining about that in a little bit. I want to start with, uh, a land acknowledgement in saying that I'm calling from Toronto. And rather than just sort of parking at this being the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Wendat First Nations, I try to do a little bit more than that. Each year, there's Treaties Recognition Week in Ontario. And this year, I spent Treaties Recognition Week learning a little bit more about the treaties that have shaped Toronto. And in particular, I found out that, well, Toronto's a desirable place to be for a lot of reasons, one being access to water and waterways. So in 1788, there was the Toronto Purchase. And what happened at the end of the Toronto Purchase was the Crown's representatives walked away believing that they'd purchased a block of land from Ashbridge to Etobicoke. And the Mississaugas believed that they'd made a lease agreement guaranteeing their right to use those lands to hunt, fish, and access the waterways into perpetuity. And I found out on the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation that the marks of the chief who signed that agreement and the deed itself were on two different documents. And what I'm getting at is that beyond um, just being aware that treaties have shaped where I live, like there's also a recognition that we're part of broken treaties or treaties that weren't negotiated with, um, yeah, I guess like with fairness in mind, right? And so as a settler today, I'm part of those treaties. And as an organization oriented towards gender justice, we try to avoid those like tokenistic land developments because in everything that we do, in for example, for gender justice, actions speak louder than words. And so anytime that we're paid to facilitate or speak, we set aside part of that to a local indigenous organization as part of our ongoing commitment to decolonization. And I'm not saying that to like toot our own horn and say, wow, we're so great, but just to encourage everybody to think a little bit more, right? About the land that you call home, some of the history that you might be part of, and what it might look like to turn, to turn a commitment to truth and reconciliation into action. I will tell you a little bit more about myself. I'll tell you a little bit more about the organization that I'm speaking from, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about what to expect for today. And that includes like what exactly to expect with interaction and Zoom chat and that kind of thing. So no stress at this point. Really quickly, my name is Jonathan. My background's in education, and I've done some really cool work with next gen men. I'm really, really jazzed. Have you noticed how like kids are like, I'm not four, I'm 4 3/4. So I'm like 5 3/4. I'm just about 6 years old with next gen men. And in particular, one of the things that is relevant to this session is that I've got a deep passion, first of all, for boys' well-being and nurturing their positive development into young men. I also got a deep passion for wilderness experiences in the camp industry. I spent a decade working at a summer camp in Algonquin Park, and I'm excited to bring those two passions together. That's something that I've been doing over the last couple of years in particular. And also excited to share some of what we've been doing and what we've learned with the camps community. In terms of next gen men, sort of like how do you explain like your like life's passion and the organization that centers around it? But here's what I'll tell you: we're a pro-feminist organization working towards feminist values and basing our work on intersectionality, strengths based, in that we're not getting like sucked down into this like, and we'll talk a little bit more about toxic masculinity. But we're not getting like dwelling on the harm and the like the toxicity that's present, but orienting ourselves towards believing the best in men and engaging them as not like allies for girls and women or as problems to be fixed, but as shared stakeholders in the movement for gender justice. We're this is like oh here you can't really see in one moment. We're youth centered, and this is like one of the hugest things about what I do is just really center ourselves on that next generation of men. That's why we call ourselves the next generation of men. And then lastly, relational, recognizing that relationship is the medium through which all growth and transformation takes place. So Next Gen Men is an organization that's been around for almost 10 years and has done a lot of different work in schools with educators and in workplaces, particularly workplaces such as like resource extraction industries or tech industry, sports industry, that kind of thing, and community organizing as well. And we have also been developing, as I mentioned, um, wilderness expeditions and camp sort of summer trips with young people and doing some professional development and trainings with camps as well. So that's your snapshot of me and of the organization. And then one more thing I'll do for our introduction now is just to give you a snapshot of what to expect for today. So, first of all, we're going to start by getting on the same page about what we mean by positive masculinity and how it can be understood alongside ideas like toxic masculinity and precarious masculinity. From there, we're going to dial into rites of passage, how they're missing for boys and young men today, and what they look like when they're designed with intention and purpose. Lastly, we'll explore strategies related to nurturing authentic connection and challenge, and how those culminate in a transformative experience for masculine identifying youth. And we're going to do our first interactive Zoom piece, which is to say that none of this is hypothetical. This is not theoretical work. This is work that is motivated by and grounded in the lives of young people who really mean a lot. That can't be understated, and that's got to be where we start today. And so, my invitation, this is optional, but my invitation is think about a young person who matters to you, who's been part of your camp community, maybe who's coming this summer for the first time, or who's been coming for years. And just put the initials of that young person into the Zoom chat. Okay, so again, just spending a moment thinking of that young person, reminding ourselves like we're dialing into this because we care about that young person's well being. We care about who they're becoming. And that's one of the most powerful things camps do, right? Is care. Thank you. The title for this slide is Toxic Masculinity. I wouldn't really call this video toxic. I would call it relatively stereotypical. You can see below it, there's two questions. What elements of stereotypical masculinity do you notice in watching this video? And do you think what's happening is a healthy or unhealthy conversation? There's no right or wrong answers to this. So I do invite you to just sort of share what comes to mind for you. I first came across this video on Instagram and it resurfaced for me a few weeks ago. I was really glad to find it again so that I could share it with you.
Would you guys be there for me if I was going through something?
No. Nope. Absolutely not.
I hope it sucks whatever you're going through.
I hope it I hope it emotionally scars you for the rest of your life.
I hope you reach out to me so I can ignore you. I can't wait to go to your funeral knowing that I could have changed that outfit. Real quick.
I was just asking if you wouldn't be there.
Okay, so again, going back to the Zoom chat, the questions are what elements of stereotypical masculinity, like the typical ways that boys are expected to be boys, what do you notice? I mean, I personally, like, I'd be curious to know what does their friendship sound like outside of this joking conversation? And is it surface level or do they actually go deeper? And if they do, then how do they do that? Just to sort of finish up this little media piece, like I mentioned, it was on Instagram. These are a couple of comments on the Instagram post itself. So you can see the top rated comment is a person saying, no, these are the ones who would actually be there for it. And kind of like some of us might, like persons being like, this seems kind of terrible. And again, this guy at the bottom saying, that's actually what male friendship looks like. And these guys would probably be the first ones there for him in reality. For me, the like whether or not this is healthy or unhealthy really hinges on that probably. Because like it makes me want to ask, are they or aren't they? Right. And how does the guy feel, who's filming this clip, like how does he know? What they're joking about are the tenets of what researchers often refer to, and I think I said this myself, as traditional masculinity ideology, right? The set of expectations for what it means to be a man. Facilitators sometimes refer to this as the man box. You might have heard of this exercise or seen it in a documentary or anything or something like that. It's a pretty popular way of getting at the narrative, stereotypes, and expectations and pressures face us as boys becoming men. Stephanie and I have done this workshop with hundreds and thousands of students. And so we know the answers are very familiar to boys. And so I'd love people to just quickly popcorn back into Zoom chat. What comes to mind when you think of the tenets of the man box? What are some of these stereotypes, expectations, and pressures about what it means to be a man? You just happen to coincidentally get the first two on this list. The ones that I'm showing on the screen are from a research study from a global nonprofit named Equimundo, and they came up with 7 pillars for the man box. Please do keep brainstorming in Zoom chat, but I'm going to start sharing them on the screen as well. We have self sufficiency, the expectation that a real man is going to be able to handle his own. Toughness. We've all heard, and boys still continue to hear today, boys don't cry. The expectation to be physically attractive, right? The expectation to be aggressive and dominant and not back down from a fight. There's also rigid gender roles, right? The expectation you've got to be able to, like Sean just said, be able to provide for others. Totally. And these are all sort of underscored, I guess I'd say, by heterosexuality, homophobia, and hypersexuality as well. Like I said, Stephanie and I have done this activity with thousands of students, the same answers every time. And the interesting thing that I often say to students, and I invite you to, if you ever use this kind of activity, like to say this to your campers as well, is the interesting thing is nobody here is surprised. And that is interesting because nobody here was actually told, right? Nobody ever sat you down and said, here are the rules to manhood. This is what's expected of you. Or you never took a class, right? Explaining what it means to be a boy or be a man. And yet we all still know these rules and expectations. I often ask students, okay, if that's true, then where do we get these messages and representations? The answers are from our peers, from our parents, from traditions, right? From social media, TV, movies, from music, from billboards, posters, commercials. And what that is getting at is that these are ubiquitous. They're ever present in our society. Now, the interesting thing about toxic masculinity, if we want to call it that, is that the human body is actually designed to resist toxicity. A single cigarette is not going to give you cancer. It's only when you start breathing it in day after day that it becomes dangerous. And the way that I sometimes think about this is like a river. Why I chose this background image, because if there's this river of toxicity and boys have got to like spend time in it and around it and cross it, like how are we as the adults, educators and caregivers in their lives, like how are we creating stepping stones? How are we like designing structures that offer eddies, anybody that does canoeing with their camp, that helps them resist that current? Or how are we helping them balance each other out? Or dry their shoes out after they get wet? Like that to me is all getting at the fact that just like combating toxic masculinity, like we could defeat it, is actually not doing as much as maybe just walking alongside boys while they navigate that terrain, right? And giving them opportunities to breathe fresh air, to be themselves, and to support each other. It's another good point that it makes you just feel bad, right? As a boy or as a man, you know? And boys and young men are desperately looking for representations to help them understand this is what it looks like to be a positive man, in society today. I kind of think about like what are the limitations? One of the ways that I phrase the limitations when I'm doing trainings with educators and camp staff is that it's kind of like if you're building a house and you've got an architect and the architect tells you like, don't burn the house down. And you're like, and so for me, it's kind of like, well, okay, great. Hopefully I won't. But does that actually help me build a house? Does for a blueprint, right? For what we're actually working towards. Before we get to positive masculinity, I want to touch on the idea of precarious masculinity. So this is it's rooted in similar elements of like recognizing the harm that is sometimes experienced by or perpetrated by boys and young men. The idea of precarious masculinity is that boys and men experience masculine identity or manhood as something that needs to be proven, something that can be called into question anytime, whether that's their status, their social status, or just their identity. And that happens in a way for boys that rarely happens for girls. Let me give you an example. Does everybody know? Just quickly say yes or give me a thumbs up if your video open. Does everybody know what bridge jumping is? I always wonder, is that like a very rural Ontario kind of, do we know what bridge jumping is? Okay, I think a couple should. I'll just quickly, it's really simple. You got a river, you got a bridge that's hopefully not too high, And young people, trying to kill time in like rural Ontario, I'll say, are just going to jump off that bridge and go swimming. Bridge jumping. Yeah. And that's literally what we're talking about. Literal bridge jumping. So if there's a girl who's with a group of friends who's a little scared to jump off that bridge into the water, what do you think her friends might say to her? Any ideas? What are some of the phrases that the group of friends might say to that girl? Okay, we have, it's okay. Maybe you don't have to. Totally. We'll go together. Okay, now let's compare to what about a boy who's scared, who's being pressured by his friends? What then might he be told? Yeah, we have don't be a wimp, suck it up, don't be a dot, dot, dot. The dot, dot, dot is in a lot of cases. Well, here, I'll just tell you that this little anecdote was inspired by a story written at the start of a book called Boys Will Be Human by Justin Baldoni, who's been doing some interesting work in sort of nurturing positive masculinity. He has a podcast called We Are Man Enough. And this book is written for middle school boys. And he opens the book by describing his own experience bridge jumping when he was about 12 years old. And what he gets told, he's the only one in his group of friends who hasn't jumped in the water, and he gets told, "Jump in." And forgive me for the vulgar language on a webinar, but he gets told, "Jump in, don't be a bitch." And in that moment, he's like, "I would rather die than be a girl." Because that's what's scary for him. He's at this bridge. He's like, if I jump into this water, I'm going to die. It's way too high. I'm not ready for this. Like my life is on the line. And he jumps because that's what's at stake, right? Because his entire identity and status with this group of friends has been called into question by being told, don't be a bitch. Okay. And so this is sort of getting at that sensation of precarious masculinity. And what we see is that boys might end up acting in ways that defend, reinforce, or prove their masculinity. And we've got to keep in mind these actions take place in a culture like we identified on the previous slide that validates toughness, hypersexuality, and aggression as ideals for men. Now, the thing that's kind of nice about precarious masculinity is that it doesn't presume that masculinity itself is problematic. It considers when and how this pressure to prove yourself might result in harm. So there's a researcher named Judy Chu who actually Steffi and I were just on the phone with last week, and I told her, "Hey, I use quotes from you all the time in the trainings that we run." So Judy Chu wrote an article where she kind of spells this out in a really, really powerful way. She says, for example, masculine norms that emphasize independence become harmful when boys project this image of stuff. So first of all, I'll just say independence is not bad, right? People who work with young people, we know we want them to be independent more often than not. But boys are constantly trying to prove their self-sufficiency and prove that they can succeed on their own. Judy Chu points out they're going to end up isolated. They may end up isolated and alone, even when they've arrived at the top. Or another example that she says is masculine norms that emphasize toughness. Like toughness is also not bad. A lot of us probably run backcountry trips or like are having young people that are like doing things for the first time and being tough about that, having grit and resilience. Like those are again good qualities. But if a boy in his efforts to project this image of strength and power to prove that he's not weak and not unworthy, like if he ends up using violence and aggression to influence others, then he's going to inadvertently create a competitive and antagonistic environment, both for others and for himself. So what we can see is that like it can go both directions, right? Independence is not bad. Toughness is not bad, but overemphasizing those and enacting them in harmful ways, that's where problems can occur. I often say to young people, like, you got to prove that you're strong. Sure, I get it. You can prove that you're strong by dominating others. I get that. You can also prove you're strong by lifting them up. And both of those things take strength. Or if we go back to the bridge story, like jumping takes bravery, 100%. But it also takes a lot of bravery to resist the peer pressure of your peers, right? So a boy sitting on the bridge, like watching his friends swim, knowing that this was not the right time for him to jump off a bridge, he might be the bravest one there. So what this shows us with what the idea of precarious masculinity gets at is that maybe you do have to prove yourself as a man. We don't necessarily have the ability to change that kind of sensation as boys become men, but you can prove yourself in all kinds of ways. And if we orient boys towards positive outcomes, we might have better outcomes. I feel like I just dropped that sentence grammatically, so forgive me if I just was like not articulate. But what this is getting at is that we need boys who are connected to a certain level of commitment to their awareness of and a commitment to their own values. So now we're going to be talking a little bit more about what do we mean by positive masculinity. I can't sit here and just tell you, oh, the qualities of positive masculinity are A, B, and C. Easy peasy. Because it's not as simple as that. I'm going to tell you why. Firstly, I'm drawing on another piece of research from a study that explored adolescent boys' views of masculinity and emotion management and their own the potential effects of that on their well-being. So, in their research, they identified three different orientations among the boys in their research. The first I already have on the slide is an orientation towards toughness. Within this orientation, the peer group pressure forces boys to follow the social norms of the group and mask their true feelings. Okay. So that's Justin Baldoni jumping off the bridge. He's orienting himself towards toughness. A quote that gets these are quotes from the youth in their study. So, a quote from a young person in the study that sort of demonstrates this orientation is, "Look, I kept a lot inside of me, and I think that's because you don't want to show that you're weak. I think boys want to hold back and not really show how and what they feel because they want to have that macho image." Okay. We're probably pretty familiar with that orientation towards toughness. It crosses over with toxic masculinity, the man box, and the things that we've already discussed. The next orientation that they describe in this piece of research is an orientation towards sensitivity. So within this orientation, there's a value of being soft and being able to show expressions that are traditionally considered feminine. So boys that are oriented towards sensitivity would like to be able to seek help, communicate about their feelings, but often they hesitate because of the group norm. So similarly, there's a boy in their study who said, "I think many guys are kind of afraid of how people will perceive them, and they think maybe it's unmanly to sit and talk about feelings." But this kid says, "I think as long as I feel safe with those I'm with, it's no problem." One of the limitations of the orientation towards toughness and the orientation towards sincerity, sorry, I said the wrong thing, orientation towards toughness, or orientation towards sensitivity, is that they're adhering to the group norm. They're really, really paying the most attention and placing the most weight on their peers' perceptions, attitudes, and beliefs. Which brings us to the third, and I think this to me, like most clearly spells out what do we mean by positive masculinity, is an orientation towards sincerity, which means you can be tough or you can be sensitive. What matters is that you're sincere. So, though, different social contexts do have some influence, like you're not unaware of the context that your other peers that you're with, the situational and personal factors um, are present. The idea of just being you it's just like viewed as like far more important than those contextual factors. So we have boys who are oriented towards being sincere. And I love this quote because it's just got this like, unapologetic certainty. Am who I am, and I'm proud of my gender. And this is what positive masculinity means to me, respect towards others. That like level, we sometimes as adults are like, oh, toxic masculinity. Like, what do we mean? What are we getting at? And this kid's like, I get it. Am who I am, but I'm respectful towards others. And that's what manhood means to me. I think young people carry a lot of wisdom. They know a lot of this already. They've felt it within themselves. And if they're given opportunities to say it out loud, they will. And they'll say it often with more clarity, than most of us adults could you know, uh, or have at least before. So I'm going to share an audio clip from a young kid that was part of a podcast series that I created as part of Breaking the Boy Code. The podcast series is called Lewis's Story because it's this self-told story of an 11-year-old named Lewis who transitions from, to be blunt, being a pretty significant perpetrator of pure violence. Like a kid ends up in the hospital with broken ribs. And this kid, Lewis, orients him. He like stops and works with me, talks a lot with me, and orients himself towards a new possibility for who he's becoming. And this audio clip is just one piece of our conversation as we're wrapping up the podcast series.
I don't know. I don't know why you can't be both. I mean, why does it have to be one or the other? You can kind of just be whatever you want to be. And it doesn't make you not a man or not a boy. Like
Okay.
Ethan. I mean, just because he wants to wear something different doesn't make him any less tough either. I mean, everybody is different. So that's a good thing because you don't want to be like everyone else. You just want to be yourself.
I'm just going to quickly send positive vibes to Lewis and gratitude for his wisdom. And yeah, just to reiterate, like everybody's different and that's a good thing. And I don't know why you can't be both, right? Strong and sensitive, tough and gentle at the same time. With at Next Shaman, we often talk about an expansion of possibility for masculinity rather than redefining masculinity, just expanding what's possible, which means that your own personal definition of masculinity might include stereotypes like strength, bravery, joking, like we saw in that first video clip. But can you orient yourself towards positively impacting yourself and others? Yeah, you can. And this means that we end up with a generation that is just being themselves and bringing their strengths and their qualities to their own well being, to their connections with their peers, and the communities that they're part of. The thing is, that's pretty hard to do alone. So that brings us to rites of passage. Back to Zoom chat, we're going to do a quick brainstorm about modern rites of passage or what we think about when we think of rites of passage. So in Zoom chat, I would love to hear what comes to mind when you think of the regular rites of passage. I guess I want to acknowledge that mo- rites of passage are nothing new, right? They're present. And like weddings in a lot of way could be considered a rite of passage. Graduation was named. Funerals are another, right? These are all rites of passage that mark someone's transition or their role or their identity going from one element in our culture to another. And many of them that are super institutionalized and super both common and viewed with a lot of gravitas, right? We take these things really seriously. And these elements of like funerary rites, like those have existed since time immemorial. Something that we've lost, which some people in the chat have been sort of picking up on, is what about that transition from childhood to what does that rite of passage look like? And that's where it's a little bit harder to put your finger on. Is it shaving? Is it getting your driver's license? Is it drinking or a romantic relationship? Like, what is it that's marking boys' transition, for example, towards manhood? So we'll talk about that in a bit, but I will give you a little bit more information on what are we really talking about when we're talking about rites of passage. So first of all, you might know some of this already, but the phrase was popularized by an ethnographer in the 19th century named Arnold van Gennep, who sort of dedicated his career to studying the ceremonial patterns within different cultures and sort of traveled around the world, engaging with both ongoing and historical, cultures and traditional groups. In particular, he started noticing there's a pattern of doing something ritualized to mark the passage from one situation or social identity to another. And the metaphor that he gave is like if you're a house and you're walking from one room to another, there's this passageway in between. And that passageway in between is what he called a rite of passage. And he published it in a book you can look up called Les Rites de Passage in 1909. So, according to Arnold van Gennep, there's three distinct stages in a rite of passage. There's separation. I'll just tell you them really quickly. There's separation, transition, and return. And interestingly, if we go back to some of the rites of passage that we described, you can notice what is like what's present and what's missing. And like I won't go down this rabbit hole, but it's a fascinating thing to think about. The separation, transition, and return for, let's say, for example, a woman getting married, right? Or a body transitioning from life to death. Like, yes, I can see. I'll just say this for myself. I can see the separation, transition, and return. Like I see that present in those ceremonies. A little less so, right? With shaving, with getting a driver's license, like the stages are a little bit blurrier and or just not present at all. When we think about some of these um, elements to growing up that right now are our best option to turn to in terms of identifying a rite of passage from adolescence towards adulthood. By the way, just as a quick digression, I do my best to use gender neutral language because we do work with non-binary youth. But in talking about rites of passage, like there are probably moments where like just what come out of my mouth is like boys to men and that kind of thing. And so just sort of acknowledging that. Um, I think I might have been, bouncing back and forth between how I was gendering my language. So just acknowledging that. Let's get started by identifying some of these. And I'm going to describe them a little bit with like that transition from from adolescence to adulthood. I'll just say there's a different researcher named Arna Rubinstein who's in Australia, and he describes this as a boy to man rite of passage. And he identifies this as like something that was dominant in all kinds of traditional cultures. They viewed it as one of the most important rites of passage that they participated in. So, what I'm going to do for describing these different stages is talk about them kind of through the lens of that boy to man transition. So, back to separation. The separation is marked by a departure from the familiar, right? So, getting away from the surroundings, the identity that you've always been part of, so that something new can take shape, that you can take on a new role or become someone new. And one of the ways you have to do that is by getting away from the context that you spend every day. Partly because it's distracting, right? Today we've got phones and internet, like keeping us from like thinking, deeply or meaningfully about who we are and how we belong. And also because there's those existing relationships and expectations that are holding us static. So the first stage to a rite of passage is that separation. Camps probably have uh, maybe a dual separation going on. One is a separation from home community, and another might be a separation from the broader camp community onto a smaller trip. We'll talk about that a little bit as well. The next stage is a transition. And Van Gennep describes this as a liminal space. Rubinstein identifies that it's characterized by shared storytelling that passes on lessons, cultural values, and engages youth in reflection on who they've been and who they're becoming. The other important element to it is authentic challenge that pushes them outside of their comfort zone and marks the beginning of when they became something more than they were before. Because if your past self wasn't capable of that thing and now you've done it, your new self has new capabilities, new stories, new relationships, and also new responsibilities. And the third and final phase is the return. I can't remember where I picked this up, if I wrote this myself or if it's from a different, different voice or researcher and influencer in the work that we do. But at some point I started saying for anybody to see themselves, they have to be seen by others. You can't change if no one around you acknowledges that you have changed. And so the return is about honoring that transition and reintegrating with the community that you were part of, but not as the person you were before. As part of this um, brainstorm, we kind of identified a little harder to put our finger on exactly what rites of passage towards manhood look like today. That's totally, totally tangible for me. And I was going to use the quote, you might have heard the quote, if a child isn't embraced by the village, they'll burn the village down to feel the heat. I just couldn't use a quote that's just attributed to an African proverb. And so I thought about it a little bit further and decided to just sort of get at what's missing for boys and young men using this quote. There's no such thing as weeds or bad men. There's just bad cultivators. I picked up this quote from a 2019 French film inspired by the 2005 Paris riots. And if you're like, hey, I might watch this, then spoiler alert, because I'm about to tell you like the very last scene. So maybe just cover your ears for a few moments. The film ends with a young adolescent boy holding a Molotov cocktail, staring at a police officer who's drawn a gun and pointed it straight at him. That's a dramatic representation of like how far things can go with boys and young men who aren't offered opportunities to meaningfully transition towards adulthood, being held in community that cares about their well-being and will walk alongside them as they become men. It's a dramatic example, but it's not unrealistic because when we look around us, well, we can see two things. The first is men like that police officer who are still guided by what Arna Rubinstein calls boy psychology. Let's do a Zoom chat brainstorm. I'm going to tell you these different qualities. I didn't write them on a slide, but I'm going to tell you these qualities and tell me if you think of a celebrity, like anybody, like um, a well known person or people that come to mind when I tell you these qualities of what Arna Rubinstein calls boy psychology. The first is I am the center of the universe and I need constant acknowledgement. Other males are competition and power is for me. I will live forever. I take no responsibility for my actions. I'm ruled by my emotions. There's two names that came up for me when I read that. One is definitely Donald Trump. And I'm not trying to politicize this conversation, really. I just like I'll just say from myself, from my perspective, again, setting aside politics, I think of Donald Trump when I hear those qualities of quote unquote boy psychology. I also think of Andrew Tate. And those are two really, really dominant voices that are also trying to tell everybody this is what it means to be a man, right? And it's a re-entrenchment of those man box qualities that you've got to be tough, be aggressive, and don't back down, right? And everybody else has got to pay. So that's one element is that police officer holding that gun, being like, this is all that I've got. The next thing that we might see is that boys and young men will initiate themselves. Right? If you want to know that you've become a man, but your community, the adults in your life, they aren't really helping you identify that moment in your life, you're going to figure it out for yourself. I'm going to show you this as a film. We're not going to watch the whole short film, but I'm going to show you the final sort of 60 seconds. I guess just as like a trigger warning, like it's not, like I wouldn't call it like not safe for work. And I wouldn't call it like, you know, inappropriately, gory or anything like that, but it is like it's a visualization of hazing violence. So just a heads up that that's what this 60 seconds entails. While you watch this, like I hope that this is an inspiration for Zoom chat like contributions about what marks the transition from boyhood to manhood in our society and what harms might be present if boys and young men are just making them up themselves.
In order to survive, a chameleon will change color to blend in with its surroundings. At a young age, I began to closely observe the people around me, the way they talk, the way they walk, what they said, where it got them. Now, I am no longer a person, but a set of social cues. Not a person, but a path of least resistance.
So just to reiterate that, it's a short film that is called American Male, and it's about how masculinity takes shape and is shaped by fraternities and hazing in American culture. And the narrator, who's positioned as this sort of guy with the jean jacket in this hazing sort of ritual, says a chameleon will change its spots in order to fit in. At a young age, I paid really close attention. I started paying attention to the people around me, the way they talked and walked, what they said, and where it got them. And now I am less of a person and more of a set of social cues, not a person, but a path of least resistance. So first of all, that like we might just be like re-entrenching the past. And we know the past is not defined by like justice and harmony, but by like hierarchy, oppression, and violence. Like that cannot be ignored. It might lead them away from their authentic self, right? And kind of like this guy in this short film indicates, like just following along with their peers, whether or not that's who they want to be. And that also might be something negative. They might end up driven by a need to impress others, whether that's other boys, to impress girls, for example. They might end up with less empathy, having not had chances to practice that with each other. It goes on. There's a lot of harm that's possible. Yeah. And before we keep going, I just like sometimes in moments like this, like I just have a physical sense, like I just want to acknowledge harm has happened. And so sending like healing and hope to anybody who's like currently in, a harmful situation or someone who's both perpetrated and experienced harm in the past. Like just sending some love out. And with next gen men, we've been thinking about this a lot, right? We're orienting ourselves on this idea of nurturing boys into being their best selves. And it's looked like a couple of different things. First of all, I'm going to set the foundation by talking about Next Gen Men Boys Club, which I'm going to describe briefly, and then talk about how we've integrated some of our what we know about positive masculinity and into that framework of rites of passage. So first of all, Next Gen Men, you might already know this, but Next Gen Men's like uh, the center of what we did for years was grant funded school based programs that we delivered and evaluated in partnership with a couple of different school boards, mostly in Ontario, Canada. And uh, you might remember in the spring of 2020, the idea of facilitating in person in schools abruptly came to a close, which meant that we hit the drawing board and we worked with young boys who said, if you want to build community online, that's happening on Discord. And we piloted it. We initially called it Next Gen Men Summer Camp and sending positive vibes to every single one of you who probably navigated a really, really difficult time, just like we did. We totally get it. And one of the things that we did, as probably a lot of you did, was a virtual summer camp. We just sort of tried that out and we found Discord has a lot of possibility. And just to fast forward, this Next Gen Men Boys Club Discord server has become, first of all, a really unique corner on the internet where positivity and inclusion are the uh, the baseline of like how we show up for each other. And it's also being positioned as a promising practice for the broader field of gender-based violence prevention. And one more thing about it is that it's become the biggest feeder for our in-person rite of passage wilderness expeditions, which is interesting because many youths on the Discord server are into video games and not, having experienced lots of like wilderness backcountry expedition, they've still decided this is something they want to take on with this particular group. And afterwards have told us this is the one of the most impactful things the Next Gen Men does. So we've integrated some key elements of our work of nurturing positive masculinity into this rite of passage framework. And I want to just, for our last sort of stretch before our questions and answers period, just sort of tell you a little bit more about that. So going back to the idea of separation. Well, we know that, yes, it's important to I was trying to think of a verb other than separate. I was going to say distinguish. That doesn't really totally make sense. Well, it's important to separate yourself from the everyday so that you can become something new. We know as an organization that the relationship is the medium through which we do everything that we do. Nothing happens except through relationship. And so at the same time as separating from that everyday context, we're actually deeply connecting with each other. using different activities, discussions, sort of scaffolded levels of vulnerability to create a sense of belonging and trust among young people who sometimes are familiar with each other because they've been part of the Discord community, and other times are meeting each other for the first time. And what this tells them is that the journey that we're about to undertake is both an individual and a collective journey. Both of those things are happening at the same time. We're going to go through this together. So, for example, uh, this is a snapshot of Spike Ball. Some of you might have Spike Ball going on in your camp communities, and first of all, it is just fun, right? We're having fun together, but at the same time, we're not just playing. This is on the day before one of our canoe trips. We're not just playing. We're also setting the tone that you can mess up and fail, right? Because none of us are very good at Spike Ball. We're also setting the tone that you like your teammate will be there next to you and help you, or at least not judge you when you fall short or need a hand. That we're going to work together to have an enjoyable experience, and then it's going to be fun. That's all part of like the subtext, and I'm sure you all do similar. Whether it's part of like pre-camp orientation or like first couple of days at camp, like those like settling in exercises, setting group norms, creating senses of connection and belonging. Like I'm sure you do similar things. That need to be sort of spelled out though to specifically say that like we don't identify independence as the be all and end all of what we're doing. By being in relationship and a community with each other, that's where a transformational experience will take place. Within the transition period, we as an organization have done a lot of work to try to make sure that our trips are carefully designed so that they fall within the zone of proximal development. You've probably heard of the zone of proximal development. That comes from, at least for me, comes from outdoor education training. That you have your comfort zone, that stretch zone, and a panic zone. And so we're not placing youth, in that comfort zone where it's just front country camping, or an everyday, afternoon at, on the camp property. It's also not panic zone where you're like, I am so far from home and I'm in such an uncomfortable and like scary and like daunting experience that like I am not learning anything. I'm just freaked out. So we're not in comfort, we're not in panic zone. We're leveraging the zone of proximal development where you're given the opportunity to push yourself. I often say to parents and guardians, like, we're not a boot camp. We're not about like, you gotta be tough to be a man and and we're gonna push you so hard and grind you into the dirt. Like, we're not like at that level. We're giving you an opportunity to do something you never have before, to push yourself, right? And to know that like we've got your back. We're here with you. We're checking in with you and supporting you. And we're leading the way to say, this is where we're camping tonight. This is like what's ahead of us. And what will happen at the end is that you've pushed yourself further than you even realized that you could go. I mean, we're above the tree line, as you can see. And on this ship, like we had rain, 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 nonstop. This is like you can see like the like two of them still have the rain jackets on. I mean, there's as you usually have, you have this like 14-year-old boy that's like, I'm gonna wear a t-shirt and shorts because like that's where I'm at in terms of adolescence. But you can see the guys still have their hoodies and their rain jackets and like I think it was terrible weather. It was so rainy and so cold. But it also doesn't need to be like way off, like in the Rocky Mountains or like some like it can also be a little bit closer to home. And so this is a different trip where we're on the French River Delta, which is a flatwater canoe trip in Ontario. It's like really not that hard to navigate. It's not. It doesn't have whitewater. It doesn't have for me as like an experienced tripper, like it doesn't have anything that scary. But I will tell you, on Tanvat Island, several kilometers from mainland, surrounded by nothing but Georgian Bay with no other people around us. Like there also was something there in terms of the zone of proximal, that we're so isolated. We're so far out that all we've got is each other. Like you can feel that. And that has also got its own level of challenge. In the challenge, you have a context in which you really can't fake it. I think I wrote down somewhere like the bravado is stripped away because you have to be yourself and that's all that you've got. And at the same time, you're surrounded by a group of peers next to you. What this does is two things. The first is that you're not alone in overcoming the challenge. I already kind of touched on this, but I want to kind of hammer the point home. There are enough instances in boys' lives where they're told to be a man means to be on your own, to be utterly independent. I talked about how we discuss that with boys, and they're like, it's from our peers and our parents, it's from movies and TV shows, like it's ever present in our life that that's what that means. So we've, as an organization, actually intentionally focused on interdependence as a counter to that narrative, that your independence can be fostered by your connection to others. It's like that classic again. I know I'm like just like popping out with all these different quotes, but like it's like that the classic quote. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. We're going far on these trips, but also in our journey from like adolescence towards manhood. And so let's do that together. A story that gets at that is again in this pouring rain on this trip in the Rocky Mountains. Like it was close to 0 degrees. And we're all running out of wet clothing. We had already, at least for me as the trip facilitator, I'd already decided we're evacuating is like a dramatic way to put it, but we are gonna like skip our final night and go straight back to the trailhead the next day. It was cold. Everyone had sort of run out of dry stuff, and these two boys in particular, I found out the next morning as we hiked back to the trailhead, had woken up in the middle of the night. It said one of them said to the other, "You're awake," and the other said, "Yes, I'm awake." And the first kid, "I'm really cold." And the second kid said, "Should we share a sleeping bag?" And they did. And I usually tell people when I tell this story, I usually say, ideally, in an ideal world, an ideal situation, like they would all have been warm and dry and comfortable enough that like that would not have been necessary. I don't actually want young people to be so uncomfortable that they're like waking up in the night and feeling really, really alone and uncomfortable. That's not ideal. But at the same time, for them to have experienced this firsthand and learned that lesson that in the darkest and coldest night of my life, I wasn't alone and I got through it by communicating how I was feeling to the person next to me, and that we both got through it together. That's a powerful lesson. And I hope that they're carrying that lesson with them as they kind of like people mentioned, as they graduate, as they go to, wherever they're going next, to remember I'm not alone. And I know firsthand that when I'm really struggling, the best way to get through that is to get through it with someone else by talking about what I'm going through. To get back to the idea of the return and this honoring ceremony, I said going through authentic challenge, being held within meaningful relationships does two things. The first is overcoming the challenge together. And the second is that you also have the opportunity for the best parts of yourself to be reflected back to you because the youth next to you have been watching you and relying on you and supporting you and appreciating you. And like I mentioned, you've only ever just been yourself. And what this means is that when we go to do this honoring ceremony, which has taken different shapes in different trips and different contexts, but you can see in this image, I'll just quickly pop my screen to this, you can see we have sort of a throne, a kid at the center who's surrounded by these cards from the boy next gentleman's boys will be blank affirmations deck. So this kid's being told affirmations that this is the best quality I see in you. I am grateful for you because of this. I'm proud of you because of that. And I see who you're becoming. That helps young people see themselves. And with this ceremony and other ceremonies that we've done, like they've done it for this one was 2.5 hours straight. We went so long that the kid who designed the music playlist of like instrumental classical music ran out. And it was just silent. And these kids were dialed in. And like I mentioned already, like afterwards told us that was the most meaningful part of the trip. And I'm going to remember that forever. We know that there's different markers of growing up that are present. And sometimes they help boys like milestone themselves as they cross those milestone themselves. They help boys like mark for themselves as they cross those milestones. I got my driver's. I turned 16 and I got my driver's license. And that means something. I finished high school and I graduated. That means something too. I had my first relationship, and I engaged in like for example, like sexually active relationship. That means something as I grow up. So there's these different elements that demonstrate to young people that they're growing. That's good, not great. Because if we want to nurture the best in boys, we need to be doing that intentionally not accidentally alongside the other pieces to who they are as they grow up. We need to be designing structures that say, this is our vision for positive masculinity, orienting to yourself towards sincerity, knowing your own values and what you believe in, who you want to become as a young man. And within a structure that transitions you from that boy psychology of being the center of the world, being ruled by your emotions, towards being um, confident, self aware, connected to others, and capable of overcoming challenges and doing that through interdependence. Like those structures can do something really, really powerful in boys' lives. Our programming in this sort of originated as just like a passion project, on the side. Like I mentioned at the start, I'm passionate about boys' well-being and supporting like the best in the next generation of men. I also love wilderness experiences. I wanted to bring those two things together. But what I stumbled across is that like boys have said, this was the most important thing I've ever done. And for me, as someone trying, right, to nurture the next generation, that means we're onto something. And that's why I decided I want to share some of what I've learned and what I'm doing with the camps community, knowing that the communities that you lead are also doing similar work in terms of supporting development, deep relationships with peers, providing learning and leadership opportunities. All that kind of thing is transformational and can't be understated in shaping the next generation of men into the leaders that we so desperately need. So this is like my send off. I encourage you to think about your own camp, to think about your programs, your youth, the opportunities to integrate some of what has maybe been shared in the last hour or so into what you offer them, and also to remind yourself of that kid whose initials you put in the chat. What does it look like to show up, in your best way for him as he grows up as well?